I will ask Ann Pinkerton to begin.
Well, thanks again for being here. Such a nice turnout. So, the inciting event was my brother died suddenly, who was 12 years older than me, a successful doctor, and also a really accomplished elite athlete who was most satisfied while living in the wilderness doing extreme things. So that ranged from mountain biking to he would skydive, he would mountain climb, adventure racing, which is like a triathlon in the woods for days on end. I mean, anything that was challenging. So ultimately, he went on a quest at age 47 to climb all of the Colorado 14ers, which are a range of, it depends on who's counting, but somewhere in the 50 number of 14,000 foot plus mountains. And he was on his third peak when something happened and he fell and died instantly. And nobody knows because he was alone. So there was a mystery surrounding how he died exactly, especially given how experienced he was. I was his kid sister by 12 years. So he had always been very heroic to me. And it was certainly a catastrophic event for our family, even though I was 35 when he died. And so I think given how profoundly affected I was, and then feeling a bit out of sorts with how profoundly affected I was, I ended up exploring the literature of sibling loss, which is almost non-existent. And I think the dearth of literature really made me compelled to want to tell my story. I'd always been a writer, but I'm a marketing communications person by practice, and I had sort of left my poetry behind. And so ultimately, I went back to grad school, actually at Bay Path University, which is part of our connection too, in order to really get more skills behind me, in order to, I think, take this, having a story to tell and trying to make myself a storyteller. I really wanted to be able to tell my story effectively, and I wanted to honor my brother. I really wanted people to get introduced to him because he was an amazing person. And I'm so grateful that I had him in my life as long as I did. And so ultimately that's the quick version of what led to this book being created. Is that sufficient?
Yep.
Do you want me to go ahead and read something?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to read you, this is kind of dropped into nowhere, but the reason that I'm interested in this chapter right now is, well, I'm not going to over-explain it. So this is called figure drawing. And I think all you need to know is that Sean was my brother's adventure racing partner. When Sean told me about the adventure races, he explained how they would camp, ever so briefly, wherever they could, regardless of weather or locale, strategically stopping around 4:30 in the morning to grab just an hour or so of sleep. If it was scheduled this way, right before dawn, he said, you could trick your body into thinking it had a full night's rest by the increasing sunlight. It sounded equal parts romantic and torturous. I used to imagine David sleeping outside in the wilderness under a ceiling of stars. I could almost hear the crickets rubbing their legs together, playing a lullaby to him, or the water of a nearby river rushing by like soothing white noise. I saw him snug in a goose-down sleeping bag, reflecting on the day's journey, considering whether they'd been fast enough, if he'd provided the best guidance for the team, analyzing the choices he'd made. He was likely planning mentally for the day ahead, the course laid out in his mind. Whether facing mountains or desert, rocks or snow, intense heat or a shrill wind, he would be ready. Body kick-started, they would hit the trail again at sunrise. David's days of working in the ER during his medical residency had been good training, working under pressure for long stretches, not sweating the small stuff, making definitive decisions, and sleeping on cue. He could sleep anywhere. Back then, it was often in a doctor's break room on a cot under fluorescent lights, or in his Jeep in the parking lot, with the seat tilted back. It was a specialized skill, this instant nap. Arms crossed over his chest, hands tucked into his armpits, head back, ankles overlapped. Within seconds of lying down, he'd be out. Then just a little shut-eye, and he was ready to go again. He'd never had to condition himself for running hard and recharging quickly. Even as a kid, he'd run himself ragged and then crash out. Falling asleep seemed like an inborn trait. I'd witnessed this natural ability as far back as those days at the cabin in East Texas. After a long day of skiing and swimming, David would shower, lie down on the couch, and start breathing heavily right away. Then he'd be up and ready for dinner in minutes. Once David was part of a radiological practice, he would schedule himself to be on call for weeks straight with no days off to earn the extended time to journey somewhere exciting. In addition to earning extensive vacation time after brutal stretches of work, his job provided the generous paycheck for airfare, equipment, even an RV for the team. It helped them travel to exotic locales like Moab, the Florida swamplands, the Badlands of South Dakota. With bunk beds built in, they could sleep all over the country. I remember so well what he looked like asleep. His slumbering face always appeared peaceful and calm, so content there was often a trace of a smile on his face. Now I try to imagine him dead, as if sleeping, since I have no other reference. Other than that cadaver back in his medical school classroom, that body that was so clinical it belied ever having lived. I recreate David's carved-looking cheekbones, the laughter lines around his eyes, that crescent scar on his chin, picked up during some outing, and those long, wild eyebrows that we joked needed grooming. His eyes are closed, but he's no longer just sleeping. Once David told me about learning that a racing friend had been treed by a grizzly bear while hiking. Up in the branches, she was stuck, and no one was around to save her. What happened? I asked of this misadventure, assuming an impressive rescue story lay ahead. She got eaten, he said matter-of-factly. He took it in stride, and I was horrified. He told me frankly that if this was the way he went out, so be it. At least he was doing what he loved. Friends, strangers, and I even repeated that line countless times in the aftermath of David's death. Unlike so many platitudes, this statement provided comfort. There is something to be said for dying when you're happiest, most satisfied, at the top of your game. No one who knew him would have wanted David to suffer a long illness, to have a meaningless accident like a car crash, or probably even to have been incapacitated by the natural course of old age. If he'd had to choose, I think he would have embraced the saying, it's better to burn out than fade away. At least that's what I tell myself. Leslie told me, another teammate, Leslie told me that she, David, and the rest of the team had talked at great length about the risks they took. They weren't naive about their exploits. I don't know if any of them believed it would happen, especially to someone so focused on safety, so fit, so prepared. But they all talked about danger. It's not something they squeezed into the back of their minds. But what they were doing wasn't just some game, it was everything. Through these conversations, David expressed his desire to be cremated. These were apparently ordinary things to discuss on the trails during those blind night hikes and sweltering day rides. Melanie, take it away.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. What a lovely group. Thanks, Anne. I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of Anne's book, and I love it. It's a beautiful book.
And I have the privilege of her blurb.
Recommend it. So my story is set against the backdrop of the early days of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and early 90s. My father, who was a surgeon himself, had a heart attack at the age of 42 and underwent a quadruple bypass in 1985. And 8 months after his surgery, it was discovered that the blood he'd been given either during surgery or immediately following was contaminated with HIV. We were living in Canada at the time, but the same stigma, misinformation, and fear that guided response kind of worldwide to this disease was certainly present there. And, my dad, who was at the height of the medical profession, anticipated that he would be dead within months, like most patients he knew or knew about. And so he decided to avoid any of the ostracism that other people who were identified as HIV positive were facing, that he would keep his illness a secret. It ended up that my dad lived for 10 more years. And so from 1985 to 1995, from when I was 13 until I was 23, I had to carry this secret of his illness. And 6 months before he died, he and my mom published a book, and the secret was out. His illness was known. But I had already moved away from home. I had gotten married, and I wasn't there for kind of the big reveal. And so that silence and secrecy lingered with me for almost 20 more years after his death. And so it was almost 20 years after his death that I began writing this story and really kind of digging into the question of what happened to me when HIV happened to my dad. And so it's a story that's set against stigmatized illness, but it's also a story of deep grief. My dad was my favorite person, and I adored him. And so I'm actually going to read. So normally when I read things that kind of establish the cultural context a little bit. But since this is griefy talk, I'm going to read a little bit more on the grief front. And I don't think it needs any setup. Contradictions. The day after Dad died, my brothers, sisters-in-law, Chris, and I convinced my mother that Dad would want her to have a new outfit for his funeral. So we took her shopping. When we stepped through the glass-doored entrance to the Park Lane Mall on Spring Garden Road in Halifax, a blast of heat from the vents overhead hit us as we crossed the threshold, a sharp contrast to the frigid air that had numbed my face and fingers on the short walk from the car. I rubbed my hands together and glanced around. Even though it was December 14th, I startled at the merry scene that greeted me. While we'd inhabited the island of vigil at Dad's deathbed, Christmas had fully descended on the mainland. Festive garlands that showcased giant ornaments with flickering white lights hung from the third-story ceiling. Red ribbons wrapped around posts and potted poinsettias lined the walkways. An ornate evergreen, its branches adorned with tinsel and sparkling decorations, reached from the bottom floor to almost touch the glassed-in roof. Christmas carols serenaded the throng of holiday customers carrying oversized shopping bags as they rode up and down the escalators and moved in a steady stream along the corridors between stores. I felt wobbly and reached for Mom's hand. She clasped my fingers and stepped closer, and we leaned on each other for balance. The world felt out of focus, like I was seeing it through frosted glass. I couldn't reconcile all of this bright and shiny with the agony of yesterday. Yesterday, when I'd lain next to Dad's still body for close to an hour while the requisite phone calls were made and my parents' pastor arrived to sit with us, praying and reading in his lilting Scottish accent passages from scripture meant for comfort that only made me sadder. And God shall wipe away all the tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. Yesterday, when two mild men in dark suits came from the funeral home, and I'd let go of my beloved Dad's hand for the final time. Yesterday, when I'd watched the same men wheel a stretcher that carried an emaciated form, shrouded in a black zippered bag, out the front door of our house, load it into a hearse, and drive away. Our little disoriented group moved through the crowded passageway and up the escalator. We went directly to a small, upscale women's boutique on the third floor where Mom had shopped a few times before. As soon as we walked in, a middle-aged saleswoman folding a stack of cashmere sweaters behind the counter smiled broadly and said, "Merry Christmas! Can I help you find something?" There were no other shoppers in the store, so she was prepared to give us her full attention. Michael answered for all of us, just browsing right now, his tone a definitive command for her to keep her distance. She didn't take the cue. Her smile widened, and when she moved to where we were half-heartedly sifting through clothes on a nearby rack, her high heels making tiny clicks on the floor, it was clear she would not be deterred from the possibility of a sale. "I've just hung up some new arrivals over here that would be fantastic pieces for a holiday party. What are we shopping for?" Mom gripped my hand, and the anguished, bewildered look on her face sprung me to action. My mom has an event this weekend, I said to the saleswoman, deciding to harness her eagerness to move what now seemed like an ill-conceived process along more quickly. She needs something dressy, but not too flashy. I didn't tell her the whole truth, and no one else did either, so I left it at that. I'm sure we'll find the perfect thing, she said, and turned to my mother. Are you looking for a dress, pants, a pretty top? Mom's brow creased as she tried to dissect the question, and she looked about ready to cry. She had no idea what she was looking for. Maybe a skirt, I suggested, and gently directed Mom to a stool that rested against the wall. With a nice blazer, Ellen chimed in. Ellen had excellent fashion sense. She was one of those people who seemed always put together with style that appeared effortless. She followed the saleswoman over to another rack, her tacit mission to preview some options and limit the choices. When Mom emerged from behind the long cloth curtain of the dressing room, wearing a knee-length pencil skirt and a fitted black watch plaid jacket, she stood in front of the mirror, smoothing her hands down the front of the jacket, and peered uncertainly at her image. The outfit was elegant and fit her beautifully. The saleswoman, too cheerful still, couldn't stop gushing about how perfect the ensemble was. And it's so wonderfully versatile, she said more than once. Mom turned to us. What do you think? Beneath her hesitant words, I heard the real question. Is this the kind of thing a widow wears? Get it, we urged, before she had the chance to scrutinize the tags and protest the lofty prices that surpassed what she typically spent on clothing. Dad would love it, Mark said. Mom's eyes filled and she ducked back into the dressing room before the saleswoman noticed. In my mind, I saw a fleeting image of my dad, a slow smile stretching across his face, a quick nod signaling his approval. As quickly as the image came, it was gone, and I felt only the deepening void of separation that opened when the hearse disappeared over the hill at the top of my parents' street. I couldn't stand being in this store anymore, and I escaped through the open door to wait in the hallway while my brothers helped Mom pay for her purchases. I breathed in a gulp of air and leaned against the cool metal railing, staring down at the noisy confusion that filled the 2 floors below me. Crowds of people bustled in and out of the stores. The ring of their laughter and boisterous prattle hurt my ears. How was it possible that none of them knew what had happened? I wanted to tell them and make them take notice, to scream, "My dad died," into the open space in front of me for everyone to hear. It didn't make sense, all of this momentum, but I felt it happening anyway, the moving forward. I felt myself unwillingly being swept up with it, away from yesterday, away from all the days before yesterday, all the days where Dad was. I didn't want to be where he wasn't, to travel ahead into all the moments where he would never be. Mom appeared with the rest of my siblings in the boutique's doorway, a garment bag hanging over one arm, a shopping bag clutched in her other hand. She paused and blinked, adjusting her eyes from the dimness of the shop to the natural light filtering through the windows above. I reached out and took the shopping bag from her hand. Mirrored on everyone's face was the same desperation that I felt to flee this place. We hurried back down the 2 flights of escalators. As we maneuvered through the merrymaking herd and neared the exit doors, I recognized a figure approaching from the opposite direction and breathed a small gasp. Pulling her heavy winter coat around her plump body was Patty, the kind and funny palliative care nurse who'd made weekly visits to the house for the last 6 weeks to help monitor my father's meds, who'd been with us the day before he died. She stopped, and a flicker of surprise crossed her features. Then she flashed a wry smile and said, "Look, it's the mourners." Mourners. The word took hold of something that was already growing inside of me, concretizing a new identity. "We're shopping," I blurted. I held up the bag in my hands to offer further proof. "Yes, you are," Patty said. She didn't have to say anything more. She stepped forward to hug my mother. The rest of us squeezed in, a communal relief welling up in us as we each reached for a slice of reassurance from the one person in the crowd who, in this uninterrupted moment when everything seemed wrong, saw us for who we were. Thank you.
That brings up a word I'm actually going to ask you guys to talk about a little bit before we go into the quotes. And that is, I was sitting here thinking how wonderful it is to hear people talk their stories, because grief is so disenfranchised, either because of who died or because of why they died or because of, can you talk about that disenfranchised feeling and how it is embedded in your stories?
I mean, I think something that's become a bit of my soapbox, as you guys know, since losing my brother, and certainly is part of my goal with the book, is to help brothers and sisters feel like they matter if they lose each other, when they lose each other, because we will lose each other. And really, I've been continually stymied over the whole sense that somehow this loss is lesser than. Like, that's been a really pervasive feeling. And so I guess, on some level, I did this book to be like, no, this matters, this counts. And I think, I continue to be flummoxed about the fact that any grief over anything, anybody, any way they left us matters, and it should be acknowledged and respected, however a person needs to process that. So I think I felt really unseen with my loss, especially as an adult losing a sibling. We weren't in the same house anymore, blah, blah, blah. This issue of like how close we were seemed to either elevate the importance of the loss or devalue the importance of the loss. And so part of my whole jam is trying to suggest to everybody that everybody's loss matters, and that specifically brothers and sisters and siblings should be part of this canon of people we care about. I mean, they're literally the only nuclear family relation that isn't treated with the same sort of like cultural acknowledgement.
Yeah. That's why your title's so perfect. Because I remember people asking me, were you close? As though, well, if I answer that by saying no, then why are you so upset about this is the next obvious question. How about you, Melanie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of disenfranchised grief is that idea that somehow your grief is put somewhere else than kind of the traditional grief in some way, right? And I think, our story in dealing with stigma and secrecy put our grief at a different level, because we couldn't have people kind of surround us in the preceding moments to the loss, right? And so it felt like a very lonely grief. And I mean, my dad anticipated he would be dead in months. We all anticipated he would be dead in months. And we lived for 10 years thinking today might be the day. Maybe today's the day. Is this the last holiday? Is this the last goodbye? Is this the last visit? And I couldn't share that grief with anyone. I couldn't talk to anybody about what that felt like to live that day to day. And even after my dad died and his illness was known and people knew, I still felt very isolated in that we hadn't had kind of a community of support that had surrounded us through the illness. So we didn't, we had people who were kind and generous and supportive, but they hadn't lived that. I have a chapter in the book called "It Wasn't Cancer," and in no way am I diminishing the grief and loss of cancer. But I think about, cancer walks, and I think about people wearing ribbons, and I think about fundraisers, and I think, there's something really beautiful about that kind of broad spectrum of support, and I've always been very envious of that. And I write in the book that I wished the entire time my dad had cancer, which sounds so terrible to say, but it's not that I wished he had another terminal illness. I just wished he had one we could talk about. So, yeah.
And even the piece that you read, one doesn't feel one can walk in and say, we're here to buy a dress for my husband's funeral.
Yeah,
it's almost like we had what I like to call, for those of my generation, the Jackie Kennedy idea of grief, is that you wear your bloody suit down Pennsylvania Avenue and you say nothing and you ask nothing.
Right. And even, the timing is interesting too, because, it's never a good time to die, obviously, or to lose somebody, but to lose somebody against the backdrop of a holiday, right? Like Christmas, it means that, there's always that contradiction, there's always that contrast. And every year, as Christmas comes upon the world, right, I feel that same kind of melancholy that sits over it as well. So,
That's great.
yeah.
I'm going to start with, and by the way, I put a few extra copies of these down there for anyone who might want to take one on leaving. I'm going to start with a quote that Melanie loves, and I think is just so classic, from A Grief Observed, which is C.S. Lewis's book. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out to be not a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. Anybody wanna? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love that quote, because I think when I first started to think about writing this story, I desperately wished I had a map that was guiding me, that to kind of say, well, you need to start here and you need to get to this point, and then you're going to get to this point, and you'll have, outlined the process of grieving, right? And I was still deeply grieving, when I started writing, and I realized, when I read that quote, I remember thinking, that's what it feels like. It's this process of unpacking the history with the person to whom you're grieving, right? Like unpacking, who was this person to me, and what is the history that speaks to the grief that I feel, right? And that's, when we're writing these kinds of stories, we're trying to bring that relationship to light for our readers, right? We want people to understand, this is what this person was to me, and in some way, by doing that, we're able to express the loss in a more significant way. So that to me felt really vital, kind of that idea that it's not a map, it's a history, and you have to trace that history.
Yeah, I mean, that super resonates for me, because I mean, so the subtitle of my book is A Sister's Quest to Know the Brother She Lost. And the thing is, this issue of were you close was really, it started nagging at me, because I immediately was like, of course we're close. Of course we're close. We love each other. And then I had to think about all the ways we weren't close, and all the ways I didn't know him. And one of the big ways that I really didn't deeply understand my brother was why he was attracted to all this risk. And it was the thing that had taken him away from us. And so there's a huge delving into who he was and how all of that extreme adventuring really sort of underlined his personality in so many ways. And it's so funny, because at first I was very mad about the risk taking, and then there's this going through the process. I still read Outside Magazine cover to cover now. I don't do any of that stuff, but I do it because I've sort of fallen in love with like what it means to do that stuff, and it makes me still feel connected to my brother. And so I did spend a ton of time in here sort of like investigating why do people do this stuff? Why does it matter? I mean, I talked to a search and rescue volunteer to say, like, you climb mountains. Why? Like, why? It's so dangerous. It's so fraught. And I came to great revelations about why. I came to great revelations about who my brother was. I kept this relationship going. I mean, Mary has this great line of like, when someone dies, you lose, what is it? You lose a life, but not a relationship.
Death ends a life, not a relationship.
There it is.
Yeah.
And so I also sort of this was a process of also hanging out with my brother in a very intimate and profound way. So yeah, and certainly there is a sense of this being its own sort of journey, for lack of a better word, but the going through and the really getting, and as Melanie quite aptly put, the sort of processing the relationship you have with the person on the page, to not only understand how you arrived in this moment, but also to showcase them to the rest of the world.
I want to shift to talk about where art comes into all of this, because the premise is it is not just processing our story. It's taking our story beyond what happened, why it happened, how we feel about it, into something that actually has meaning in the universal world, would have meaning to other people, and why that's healing. So I'm going to use the quote that you, can I read that?
Yeah.
This is a little bit longer, but it's got so many pieces in it that I think they both can talk to. I think poetry is a way of carrying grief, but it's also a way of carrying it so that I don't always have to heave it on my back or in my body. The more I put grief in a poem, the more I am able to move freely through the world, because I have named it, spoken it, thrown it out into the sky. Everyone has grief they carry. And sometimes we have anxiety and depression about anticipatory grief. The thing I've found helps is knowing that we are all in this. Someone has gone or is going through the same thing. Poetry helps us with that too. Writing, reading, as James Baldwin said, you think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read. And that's from Ada Limon. So, you want to bounce off of that?
Yeah,
one?
sure. So one of the things I talk about in the book is being part of a bereavement writing group. And I think that's when I first learned that you could put down some of this stuff that we carry in our heads and our hearts and our bodies when we experience grief, that there's a way to take it out of here and put it there and get a new perspective on it and get some control on the experience, like in a way that we couldn't have during those chaotic, awful moments when things were happening to us. So for me, it's a little bit about taking control over my own narrative that feels really good to me. Not that I'm changing what happened, but I'm changing the way that my reader processes it, and that's part of the turning it into art. I think it is about processing the experience. It's about finding meaning in it, but it's also about shaping it. And so when I do workshops, I do talk to people about, like, you get to own this now. It happened to you, but now you get to take it and do something with it. And that there's something about that activeness of making it into something new. It's like, it's a lemons to lemonade thing, but that sounds so absurd. But there is a way of taking something terrible and making something really beautiful out of it. And so for me, it's been a profound experience taking, this horrendous thing that happened to me and my family and my brother's friends, and turn it into, like, to package it in a way that it now actually can provide meaning for somebody else. This issue of, you think your pain and suffering are unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read, that was part of my problem, as I mentioned, is I couldn't find this. I thought someone else has been through this. And then I was like, oh my gosh, my pain and suffering are unprecedented in the history of the world.
There are decidedly zero books. Or many fewer.
It's wild. It's getting better. It's getting better, but it's wild. And so that was a big, big part of what compelled me, is I wanted to offer something for another brother or sister who felt like I did, like, I'm the only one this ever happened to. How can that be? Yeah. To suggest, no, you're not. And I guess that's the universality that you were talking about, in terms of, yes, it's specifically my experience of losing my brother and my particular brother, but it's been amazing that other brothers and sisters have come out of the woodwork to say, I feel seen now. That's the beautiful gift you can give another reader if you share your story this way. And I think, it does something for the writer, for sure. And then in offering it to the reader, that's its own gift too.
And I think, a lot of us, when we start the process of kind of digging into these stories, we're not doing it thinking we're going to be giving it to other people, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of times, we're starting simply because, if we're writers, that's how we express whatever is inside us, right? It's like expressing that wound. And I think for most of us, I teach a lot of memoir. I've talked to a lot of memoirists. I think most of us begin just because we want to know what happened to us. You know, we're trying to understand something for ourselves about our experience. For Writing Hard Stories, I interviewed the writer Andre Debussy III, and he said, you know, we can all kind of say what happened, but we write to try to figure out what the hell happened, right? And so I think, you know, most of us kind of start in that place. And then, you know, for some people, that's enough. They kind of write it, they come to a place where they've processed it and they understand it, and they put it away and say, you know, that's what I needed to do. For those of us who take it this step further and decide we're going to share it with other people, that's when kind of the artistic element comes in, because we're recognizing, wait a minute, like Anne, you know, maybe there are other sisters out there who have lost their brothers and need to hear this, you know? Maybe there are other daughters who have lost their fathers, or maybe there are other people who have had to suffer in silence and keep secrets, you know? And we start recognizing that despite there is, you know, we all have a little bit of an unprecedented sense of our stories, right? Like,
Yeah.
nobody else has had Anne's story. Nobody else has had Mary's story. Nobody else has had my story. But then that universality comes through, and we recognize, you know, there might be something in my story that speaks or resonates with somebody else. And then we have to decide, how are we going to make that accessible to our readers? And that's where kind of the artistic crafting piece comes in, that we start telling the story with an intentionality of, how can I bring somebody with me on this journey and have them understand what it was like, right?
Yeah, I wondered, I remember being so shocked, and I was not a writer when my sister died. I had never written anything other than formal psychological evaluation reports. But I remember the overwhelming feelings. I went to poetry, I went to music. I had an office filled with psychology books, and they were not useful to me. Were there other kinds of art that made it, that really helped you in that personal quest? And how do you relate that to the art of words?
Right. I mean, I think poetry was a huge thing for me. I mean, and that is the art of words, but it's different. You know, it has a different quality than prose. Music has all, you know, and I think partly because music was a big part of my family life growing up. My dad was an equally skilled pianist as he was a skilled surgeon, and you know, so my entire life is set against the background soundtrack of music in our home. And so, you know, music has played an important role for me. Art, you know, anything that gives you a chance to kind of reflect, I think.
This quote, writing often reveals us to ourselves, lets us name what's important to us and what has been silent or silenced in us. And I think that's part of turning grief into art in words, is you're really sort of digging underneath what happened to what matters.
Can I go back to the music question?
Sure.
Or the other art question?
Yes.
Only because it's so funny. I think I've always felt sort of, there's a thing about when we, I don't know how a better way to describe it than when we meet a certain piece of art or a certain piece of music or a certain film or certain book, like where we are when we meet it. So I've been a huge fan of the musician Nika Case forever, and my ex-husband actually had toured with her, and so music is big part of my past. And music to me, I'm going to say it as a writer here, is to me the greatest form of art. So it's funny, but she has a record called Middle Cyclone that had just come out when my brother died, and it's, I mean, so it's about tornadoes, and it just resonated so hard. Like there's a song and it's called This Tornado Loves You, and I just felt like the whole world, like that there was this storm coming after me. And so that record, I mean, I played it into the ground. I mean, I just played it and played it and played it and played it, and that became like the soundtrack of this grief.
Yeah, it is so interesting to me that it is about finding words that describe something past what happened, past the frontal cortex, and into a different part of the brain that allows you to say, yes, that's it. That's what I felt, or that's what it was like, or and finding that label and then sharing it does give you control. Yes.
But maybe this is part of why poetry is so great too, and why songwriting is so great, is because you're getting these analogies for this experience that is so hard to explain.
To explain to other people.
Like to me, it did feel like I was being eaten by a tornado.
Right,
You know,
right.
like there's hurricanes in my book. Like the whole storm thing felt very real to me because of the chaotic, uncontrollable disaster area kind of feeling about it. And so I think poetry also, like, it takes us into these deep metaphorical spaces that feel more real in those times of deep emotion.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite poem is the poem Heavy by Mary Oliver, and I have a quote in there, but actually the part that I love about that poem is there's a part where she says, you know, that time when I could not and would not put grief down. And I've often thought about my grief as this very, very heavy weight that I carried for so long, and it was a burden in a way. And I think when I first started writing, I was like, okay, I'm going to put it down. I'm going to write this book. It's going to be done. I was so naive. I had no idea. But what I've talked about is by writing this story, and that the poem ends with, you know, Mary Oliver talking about, do you see me carrying it differently, right? And that's what I feel like this enabled me to do. It enabled me to take that really heavy burden I was feeling and find a way to carry it in a different way. Right? I don't want to let my grief go, because then that would be, in essence, letting my dad go. Yeah. Right? And I didn't want to do either of those things. And I also realized the way I had been carrying it wasn't healthy. And I needed to find a way to carry it so that I could keep living and finding joy in life. And, you know, writing the story helped me to do that.
We are at quarter of, so I'm going to open it up for questions that you might have for the authors before we.
Great.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Back in March, when you were first scheduled to do this presentation, I read all 3 of your memoirs in 1 week.
Oh, thank you.
You're amazing.
Really sobering week.
I was going to say that's a heavy week.
You needed a big glass of wine.
And I thought about these are deeply personal stories, and yet when you publish them, you put them out into the world, and they became everyone's stories. I remember Mary Plouffe saying when she did that with her memoir, she didn't realize how it would affect her in terms of people having opinions about what happened. And, you know, it just was a very different place. I'm wondering for you all, how is that shift to it being a public story? Have you had experiences, you know, what has that journey been like?
I know you have a lot to say on this, so I'll go first. So, I mean, it was interesting. I did an interview once where someone asked how it felt to be so exposed. And I said, oh, like I didn't even think about it. I'm a very open person and by nature, and I sort of didn't appreciate how exposing it might feel actually doing it. I think that was my naivete, this is my first book, and I bled all over the page and was like, here. So I didn't really know, and I've been really lucky that I was very, very worried, like right before this was released last year. I was very, very worried that people were going to think I was a whiny, obsessive, baby loser person. And that has not been the case, which is great. In fact, I've been super honored to receive many, many, many stories of other people talking about just wanting to be heard about their loss of their brother or sister. And that's been really profound to have them just share that with me, because they want to talk to someone who gets it. And they don't know me. I mean, and they've put it in the void, like online, but they just need to know that someone's out there listening to them who gets it and who understands what this is like. So for me, it's been really good. I mean, I've been really, really lucky. Some of my family members could have been mad and they weren't. And some, you know, people out there could have thought I was a loser, but they didn't, which was really, really lucky. But I know Melanie has some rich things to say on this. So.
Well, I, on the other hand, really understood that it was going to be very exposing, and so I anticipated, like I was, I had my therapist prepped for like, I know this is going to be hard and but the surprising, I think what has been most unexpected and surprising for me is, like, I thought it would be really hard to go out and talk about this regularly because it was something I had not talked about for so long, and I had to keep it to myself for so long. And all I have found in talking about it and sharing it has been tremendous sense of joy and relief, because in a way I feel like, so this book published in September, I feel like in the last 6 months I've been more myself than I ever have been in my life. And I think it's because, we all know if we have to keep a secret or if we're suffering something in silence, it creates a barrier, between us and other people. So there's only a certain level of authenticity that we can have, right? And I think for me, writing this book took away that barrier. And I feel like, who I am sitting right here is the same person who is on the page in this book. And I'm very happy to share that person with you because I never got to be that before. I was always playing a role, always putting on a persona of being fine when I wasn't, or, everything was good when it wasn't. And so it's been a joy for me in a lot of ways. I mean, that doesn't mean that there haven't been those moments of, it's been tricky with my family. I've had, it continues to be tricky, because I've revealed things about myself that they didn't know and that they didn't understand and probably still don't understand. But I have to counter that with, at every single event I've gone to, somebody comes up and says to me, thank you for sharing this because it makes me feel like maybe I can talk about this thing. And then they tell me the thing, and I published a piece in the HuffPost recently, and I got probably 3 or 4 personal emails of people saying, I had a family member who died of AIDS and I've never told anybody that before, but I feel like I can tell you. And I think, like, even just in that moment, they're putting something down that they've carried alone and they don't feel so alone anymore. And that, to me, that makes the exposure worth it.
Yeah, that's gold to me, because that's all I ever wanted was
Right.
for people to feel connected to it.
Yeah.
Other questions? I can tell you, just to answer your question really briefly, it was horrible. I was a psychologist with 30 years experience, used to not telling anyone anything about myself. I wrote the first draft of my book thinking I was going to be writing about my 3-year-old niece whose mother died suddenly and how I got her to 15 with how her dad got her to 15 with a little bit of guidance from me. And the first time I presented it, someone said, you can't write that. You have to write your story of losing your sister. And then in that, bring in yours. So that manuscript went in the bottom drawer for 3 years because I said, there is no way I'm doing that. So I would say that was the hard, I'm a very, very private person.
Right. And I will say, this book from start to finish was a 10-year process. So, and in between there, I wrote this book. And that's because writing this book was so difficult for me. When I first started doing it, I literally would sit in front of my laptop and think, if I type one more word, I'm going to disintegrate. And and it sounds very exaggerated, but I literally thought it was going to kill me to dig through these memories and to go through this experience. And so I accidentally happened upon what became this book, which was I had a project I had to do for my MFA program where I had to, do something different than my creative thesis. And so I thought, well, maybe I could talk to a few of the writers whose books I'd been reading about kind of what is the psychological effect of, writing these kinds of stories. And I ended up, reaching out to these writers, and they were so, so generous to me with their words. And they talked to me about the process of, kind of moving through that place of feeling like you're going to disintegrate and getting beyond it, and then what that's like. And so I know that I wouldn't have been nearly as open with this book had I not had the experience of talking to the 18 writers that I talked to for this book, because they kept telling me, you will feel better. You will find joy in having told this story. You will find connection that you've never had before. And I had to trust them because they'd all done it, you know? And so I know for a fact that had I not done this first, I would never have been able to finish this.
Yeah. And I think that's most of my experience, because as a clinical psychologist, is in having people bring their grief stories to me. And I think that is where the goal is always joy. The goal is always not to let go of your grief. But I'm very fond of saying that grief is not sadness. Sadness is one emotion. It is the greediest emotion. And it is the one that takes up the most space in the initial stages of profound grief. It's the only thing that we can feel. But I think we have to recognize grief is much bigger than sadness. It has so many different colors and forms and shapes. And we're coming up to the end here, so I'm gonna, because I think we should end with a happy.
Oh, we do have a question. We do have a question here.
Good, we have
So
time
let's
to
do it.
question. Yeah.
I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about how sort of beneficial it might be for those of us in the audience that may be carrying grief but don't want to publish anything about it, but just to go through that process of writing our own stories.
Sure. I think there's great power in that. I don't think that the sharing of it actually has to be the end goal at all. In many cases, it isn't. As Melanie mentioned, like a lot of writing goes, it goes in that bottom drawer or whatever, because for whatever reason. But I do think that you can't underestimate the power of the therapeutic benefit. There really is a therapeutic benefit to processing grief on the page.
Yeah.
It's written about. So, I wanted this to be more than therapeutic, but I think there's huge therapeutic benefit in it. And I've certainly witnessed it in some of the groups that I've been part of. So I wouldn't underestimate what that could do for you at all.
Well, and I know that Kelly mentioned that I just completed a program in narrative medicine at Columbia. And, narrative medicine is a discipline that's kind of come out of Columbia Medical School and has spread kind of through healthcare practice, of the idea of the intersection between the humanities and science, right? And one of the big premises of narrative medicine is giving, patients and caretakers and practitioners the opportunity to express their experiences creatively, because in many cases they're so used to kind of the clinical work of what they do, and just the inherent value of taking a kind of a creative approach to your story. There's tremendous healing in that. And I write at the end of writing stories that, the term coming to terms, if you think about what that means, it's finding words for, right? And when we find words to express what we've been through, there's tremendous healing in that. And it doesn't have to be for anybody else. And, I don't think you ever have to feel the pressure for it to be for anybody else. But I recommend to anyone to try to find words to put to their experience if they can, just because there's something about, like you were saying, taking that control back, right? That so often experiences of grief and loss are experiences that are so out of our control. They feel so chaotic. And so then you're having the chance to kind of be in control of how you write about that and how you share it. So I highly recommend that as something to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, somebody said to me once, don't even think about where this is going.
No.
Just put it on paper first, and you can decide that later. And I think that was wonderful advice. Yeah.
But I do also, and I do this a lot with my memoir students, is make the point that you are always in control of what you decide to dig into and what you do. And I'm sure as a therapist, you would say the same thing, that, you should never feel pressure to face something that maybe you're not ready to face, or to dig into something that you're not ready. I mean, I think sometimes in MFA programs, there's a little bit of the like, ooh, this is sizzly, like dig deeper, go further. And you may not be ready to do that, So always know that you're in control of what you're digging into, what you're thinking about, what you're focusing on. And we have our thresholds of our bodies tell us, what
Well,
we're
in the
able to.
sense that you were going to die if you kept going. I mean, I actually felt like I was going to die if I didn't.
Mhm.
Like, so there was like this compulsive feeling that was,
Right.
So you do have to listen to your own sort of, I don't know,
Internal,
nervous system, because
Internal
it
compass.
will tell you
Yeah.
what works for you and what doesn't. And I always say to people who are writing through their losses to do things in small chunks, because I think that going headlong is very, very hard, especially if something's fresh. So to do like 8 or 10 minutes and take a break and come back to it, and like there are ways to do this work without feeling like you're re-traumatizing yourself, and that you do exert some control rather than the story having you in its grip.
But I do also really recommend that if you are doing this kind of work, that you find a system of support that works for you.
Oh, heavens,
I had
yes.
an excellent therapist. I was really grateful for that, and I write a lot about that actually in The Hard Silence. But for some people, therapy isn't the way to go. But you do need some kind of self-care that you're doing in that process, because you're inevitably going to dig into difficult things.
Don't you find the time frame that you describe is not atypical, that people talk about
Oh, absolutely.
5 years, 10
Oh, right.
years, 15 years?
Well, it was funny. My first MFA mentor, who I worked with my first semester in my MFA, he said to me he gave me the greatest gift ever by saying to me, Melanie, don't think about kind of the big picture, just start writing what feels important. He said that. And then he said, and like 5 years from now, when you're at a place where you think you might have a manuscript for a book. And I remember being like, 5 years, I'm going to be done this in a year. And, and it took 10 years to get to. But I think we don't know the amount of work. And I mean, the story I set out to write at the beginning is not the story that emerged. We write our way into the story we have to tell as well.
Yeah.
So
you don't know what it's going to be until it comes out on
right. And that feels counterintuitive, like you're writing what you don't know, but it is what happens. You write through it to get to that place.
I think that's the magic too, is that you can write your way into meaning that you didn't know was there.
Right.
I was listening to Kate D. Camilla and Ann Patchett.
Mm-hmm.
And Kate DeCamille says you write from the hole in your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. People talk about like writing from the wound, writing from the question that you're asking, right? Like I started off at the beginning saying, kind of the question that hung over this for me was, what happened to me, right? When HIV happened to my dad. And I don't know that I've answered it fully, but the question was what helped me find the story that I was telling.
She also has a great line when she teaches with kids. She writes Vindici kids books, and she said she'll say to the children now, how many times do you think that I got rejected? And they go like 10, 15. And she goes to the board and she writes 433. And she said, what if I stopped at 432?
Right. Yeah. Right.
All right, I like to end with a quote that always brings me back to this world and to joy, because I think that's where we all want to be for whatever time we have here. This is by Caitlin Moran. Do you know who she is? She's kind of a Tina Fey, Gilda Radner type British comedian. Mostly she writes hilarious things about raising kids. But she wrote this, which I keep coming back to. In all the eons, we have lost nothing. We have gained nothing. Not a speck, not a grain, not a breath. The universe is simply a sealed, twisting kaleidoscope that has reordered itself a trillion times over. Each baby, then, is a unique collision, a cocktail, a remix of all that has come before. made from molecules of Napoleon and stardust and comets and whale tooth, colloidal mercury and Cleopatra's breath, and with the same darkness that is between the stars, between and inside our own atoms. When you know this, you suddenly see the crowded top deck of the bus in the rain as a miracle. This collection of people is by way of a starburst constellation. Families are peculiar, unrepeatable, perambulating micro-universes. We have never been before, and we never will be again. Oh God, the sheer, exuberant, unlikely face of our existences, the honor of being alive. They will never be able to make you again. Don't you dare waste a second of it thinking something better will happen when it ends. Don't you dare. Thank you all for coming.